Well, hey there, podcast steros. Welcome back to the prestigious Pod Sound School. I wanted to quickly jump in before this bodacious episode and tell you...
Dude, where have you been, man? I've missed you.
I've missed you too, Studio Steve. Apparently I wasn't performing well with the focus group audience, so my motivational intros have been cut.
Dude, that's... I can't believe that...
We gotta give the podskis what they want, Studio Steve.
Yeah, I guess you're right. All right, go ahead with your administrative piece.
As I was saying, I wanted to remind you that we're continually adding more useful premium content for overachieving podcasters at our Patreon. Visit podsoundschool.com/premium and unlock access to your own private podcast feed that you can add to your podcast player. The premium episodes focus on monetization, email marketing, and helping you to treat your podcast like a business. And before we dive into probably my favorite episode yet, remember, good, better, best. Never let it rest until your good is your better and your better is your best.
And as I end the soldier and poet. Yes, tell this to all the world.
There are people in your personal and professional life you admire and look up to. I came across Rhea Werner a few years ago when I started listening to Girl in Space podcast. I'm not usually a fan of sci-fi, but the exceptional writing in this podcast got me hooked immediately. Anyway, Sarah is one of the people I look up to in the world of podcasting. She's a talented writer, the creator and producer of two very successful podcasts, Right Now and Girl in Space. She's a speaker, an entrepreneur, and also a podcast coach like me. I wanted to bring her on the show because she is an example of how to do things right when it comes to marketing and growing a podcast. She has found incredible success with her two podcasts, and I wanted to know her formula, if she has one. I had a great time interviewing Sarah, and I learned a lot from her, and I hope you do too. When I interviewed Sarah, she was in the middle of planning and producing the second season of Girl in Space, recording a new episode for her other podcast, launching her course, working on marketing, and getting ready for multiple speaking engagements. Wow, I was surprised she even said yes to the interview. So I had to ask her about time management and how she manages to do it all.
I work 80 hours or more a week. It's interesting because it's stuff that I want to do. Like every single thing I want to do. I love podcasts. I love writing. I love helping people. I love coaching. I love doing it all. But there's this interesting balance that you have to strike. And I'm not even sure what the word balance means at this point in my life. But there's a give and take. There's a push and pull to understanding what's important and what really moves the needle, because it's really easy to be busy. It's really easy to find work to do. It's really hard to do the right work, do the work that matters. So even discerning what do I need to be doing right now, what's important, comes with an understanding of where do I want to be right now? Where do I want to go? And this is true for any podcaster. So we tend to focus on problems of how do I fit podcasting into my busy schedule? But really, at some point, it becomes, what am I willing to give up for my podcast? Or what will this podcast do for me ultimately? And knowing that, if you're doing it for fun, that is completely worthwhile and you should do it for fun. When I talk about moving the needle, I'm talking about doing things in your life that matter and that are fulfilling. And that even comes with understanding what matters to me in life. What do I want out of life? Do I want to have fun? And am I willing to acknowledge that I want fun to be in my life? That I want to hang out with my friends and talk about The Mandalorian. And that's my podcast, right?
I would dare to say that a great majority of podcasters, myself included, get into podcasting because creating a podcast is fun. Planning and creating episodes, listening to your voice coming out of your speakers, having your podcast available on the major platforms for others to listen to, and creating a community of fans and listeners. All these things make podcasting super fun, but creating a podcast requires a lot of work and a sizable skill set. We have to become experts in audio production, or at least familiar with the technical side of podcasting. We have to learn about marketing and networking. This is why it's so important to define what we want out of our podcast and what having success with your podcast looks like.
We want to treat podcasting like we treat sitting down to do finger painting or like macaroni art. Like you just want to sit down at a table and you want to do it and you want it to be fun and easy and you don't want to have to put any planning into it because that's maybe the side of things that we don't enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do that. You can do that, but you're not going to have a successful podcast unless what's successful to you is sitting down and have. So that's why it's so important to understand like what a successful podcast means to you. So if it's sitting down, talking into a microphone and releasing it and not caring what your engagement is or your numbers are, not caring about what kind of advertisers you're landing, like that's fine. But just know that that's what you're going to get out of it. I was in marketing for 10 years. And so I had a background in marketing and especially a focus in digital marketing that allowed me to say, oh, so I've worked on all these websites, I've worked on all these digital projects. I'm going to treat my podcast like one of these projects that I work on. And so even though I'm not a planner at heart, I knew that I needed a strategy behind it. I needed to understand what my marketing was going to look like. I knew that I needed those elements in place. I think a lot of podcasters simply don't know that they need those things because you're like, oh, what do I need? And you download a 1-page PDF that says, number 1, get a microphone. Number 2, get a host. Number 3, release your podcast. And they don't tell you, hey, at some point you need to have some kind of social media presence. This is what it means to identify your audience. This is a healthy audience for you. Here's how to find them. Here's where they are. Here's how to engage with them. And, oh, I feel like I should have Facebook or I should have Twitter, but actually maybe my audience is on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. And there's just so much that we don't know at first. And that's okay. That's nobody's fault because when you sit down and create a podcast, you're doing 2 things that you're not doing when you're sitting down to create macaroni art or do finger painting. And that is, number 1, you're communicating. A podcast is a communication tool, and you really need to think about what you are communicating and why you're communicating it and to whom you're communicating it. That was hard to say. And so you really need to think about that. Number 2, what you're doing in addition to communicating is you're also creating an experience. So I believe that one of the reasons podcasting is so big right now is because we're transitioning into an experience economy. So we went from agricultural economy to an industrial economy to an information economy. I think now we're moving into an experience economy, and that's what podcasts are. And I think very few of us, myself included, know what that means. I think a lot of us are still discovering what that means and understanding that when I create a podcast, I'm not even just talking into a microphone. I am creating an experience for my listeners. And I believe that what you put into that experience and what your users take away determines, in a way, the success of your show. Again, depending what your definition of success is for your show. So I think that there's just so much we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know. And it's nobody's fault. It's not the podcaster's fault. But I think that we all need to, oh boy. And I don't know if this is like the larger public that needs to do this necessarily or where this comes from, but just raising awareness of how much work a podcast is, which when I started, it blew my mind. Like blogging, I would type up a blog post in like an hour and be done. And it's like 10 times that for a podcast, 5 to 10 times like that for a podcast. It's more similar to video editing, I think, than it is to writing.
Let's take a pause here and digest what Sarah just said. Since we're transitioning to an experience economy, what we put into the listener's experience and what your users take away is what determines the success of your show. This is why I cringe when I find podcasts with little to no production value, not enough planning or writing, or even worse, with very low audio quality. And like Sarah said, we're not only communicating with our podcast, we're creating an experience. So for those of you still on the fence of whether you should start a podcast or not, I asked Sarah what were some of the professional benefits she has experienced with her podcast and what made her decide to get into podcasting.
I tell people all the time that podcasting has changed my life. And I know I sound like one of those people who's like discovered yoga and they're like, yoga has changed. Like, it's true, right? It's true because it's changed who I'm connected with. It's changed how I think and feel about myself and how I think and feel about how I communicate with people. Before I started podcasting, I was in marketing. And so I was already sort of working on digital projects, but nothing that I was working on was beneficial to me. It was beneficial to my boss and to the businesses that I worked with. You're helping somebody else's dream. So understanding that you have your own dreams, that was my first step, was understanding that I was allowed to want more than the job that I was at. I was allowed to want things for myself. I was allowed to want to be a creator and to have my own intellectual properties. And that was light switch number one. So I was working at essentially a desk job, and it wasn't bad. It was fine. You always struggle with, am I getting paid enough? Are my benefits really that great? So I was asking all of those questions. I, at the time, joined a mastermind group. And if you're not part of a mastermind group, that has been one of the ways that I have grown the most. A mastermind group is just peer mentoring. So it's a group of 2 people, 4 people, 20 people, whatever it is, that sit down and challenge each other and hold each other accountable to the goals that they want to set to. So I was part of one for about 5 years, and then I left that one and I'm now part of a different one. Through that mastermind, I met a lot of people who were in podcasting, and I said, hey, I want to start this. And they're like, okay, let's actually make this happen. Because there's also that step of wanting to do it and then committing to do it and like actually doing it. So that was like the next switch that needed to be flipped was, okay, I'm actually going to try doing this. And I started out as a hobby podcaster. And I think that's where a lot of people are right now. They're doing it as a hobby. They're doing it for fun with their friends. And that was the most fun that I had podcasting, when I was just doing it for fun. I wasn't worried about growing it. I was like, oh, I don't care. I'm just making this because I need a creative outlet. I want to make it. But soon the podcast took off in a way that I didn't expect that it would. This was 2015, I think. There weren't a lot of female podcasters. Even in the last 4 or 5 years, the amount of women in podcasting has skyrocketed. So that was one of the reasons it took off. I was just really excited about it. I think the enthusiasm was contagious. I told my family and friends about it. I told my coworkers about it. I told everybody who would listen to me, hey, I have a podcast. Here's how I went through everybody I knew, like college acquaintances, like everybody. But it paid off. And my first show, the Right Now podcast, which is a nonfiction podcast about creating and writing and creativity, that really was what opened the door for me for everything. I think that people know me a little bit better for Girl in Space because that one kind of took off into like that place. But the Right Now podcast is really what gave me all these opportunities. So pretty soon I was being invited to speak and do speaking engagements. I was being invited to conferences. I was reaching out to what I considered to be big name writers and getting them on my show. It was just opening this world. I was suddenly getting advanced reader copies of books sent to me just because, hey, this person wants to be on your show. Here's a copy of their book signed by the author with a little letter from the publishing house. And so suddenly I was making these connections almost by accident. And it just really opened up my world because all of a sudden, the more people that you have in life who are well connected, the better connected you are. All of a sudden I was connected. All of a sudden my community was growing. And so I started a Patreon and I started making money from my show. I started selling merch for my show and just started making a little bit of money. And the podcast also, in addition to the speaking gigs and the opportunities and the connections, I also started getting people inquiring like, hey, do you do coaching? Hey, do you do freelance work? Hey, can I hire you to ghostwrite my book? And I was like, yes. And I started saying yes to all of those opportunities. And everything just bloomed and blossomed because of this podcast I had started. And I think that's still true. I think podcasting has definitely grown since then and it's definitely shifted, but I think it's still one of the best ways that you can get your name and your face and your voice and your influence and your message out there. So yeah, all of that came from the podcast, and especially the freelancing helped me build my financial runway so that I could leave my job and start my own business. After I left my job in 2017, I launched Girl in Space, which is my fictional show about a girl in space. And it took off, I think, in part because I had more and better connections. I still told my family and friends, but I also had a listener base already in place. And so yeah, that helped Girl in Space to take off. And then Girl in Space brought me more and different speaking opportunities. So talking about fiction, talking about creativity, really getting into the audio drama or fictional podcasting side of things, because there's 800,000 podcasts in existence right now. A tiny fraction of that is fictional podcasts. And so we're just getting started with that medium. And so being someone who speaks about it this early on in the game has been very beneficial to me too. So I'm not kidding when I say podcasting has changed my life. It has changed the trajectory. I mean, before 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, I was on a path to middle management at this company. And now I'm a creative entrepreneur and I travel when I want and I get to work from my home office. And it's just, life is so amazing.
The benefits of having a podcast are not only professional, but they are also highly personal. I wanted to find out what some of the personal benefits of podcasting have been for Sarah. I know I have experienced so many personal benefits like getting out of my shell and owning my flaws and valuing what makes me unique. I'm also more confident speaking into the microphone. I used to get paralyzed with fear just at the idea of being behind a microphone. And I would love to start speaking in public more, having always been a big-time introvert. I'm hoping that, like Sarah, podcasting will push me into taking on new challenges.
I'm also an introvert, and I didn't start doing public speaking really until after my podcast came out. And that has really forced me out of my comfort zone, which comfort is good. Comfort feels good, but everything that maybe you want to grow toward, if you're interested in growing, growth is uncomfortable. And so learning how to make yourself uncomfortable, coming out of your introvert shell, it's hard, but it's worth it. And so the personal benefits have been, I've made a lot of friends in podcasting. This community is so beautiful and so giving and so, I don't know, just so rich. I have met the most beautiful, amazing range of people, and it's become this like beautiful tapestry of amazingness. And so just the people that I've been able to meet and be exposed to has just been just a huge blessing in my life. Like, I'm just really grateful for the community of people I've met through podcasting that I would not have met otherwise. Gosh, also just even understanding how to make something, understanding what the creative process looks like from start to finish. Before Girl in Space, like I said earlier in this interview, like, I'm really good at starting projects and I'm real bad at finishing them. I finished a season of Girl in Space for the first time. That was the first project I ever finished. So I finally hit that goal. And it was because if I was writing it for myself, I maybe wouldn't have finished it. But I had angry fans who were like, "Where's the finale, Sarah?" And I was like, okay, I have to make this. I have no choice. I have to finish this. So learning how to finish projects, I learned how to speak. The way that I speak has changed because of podcasting. I enunciate more clearly. I've gotten rid of a lot of the ums and uhs and likes that I used to have in my speech. I'm more comfortable speaking in front of a crowd. I can get up on stage now and just say like, "Hey, everybody, I'm so glad you're here. Let's have a conversation about podcasting."
With her 2 podcasts, Sarah has created a community of passionate fans. I wanted to know how she was able to grow her audience. Besides the obvious, she's talented, kind, wickedly good at writing, and overall a cool person. But I wanted to dig deep and see if there are some things she did that we can apply to our own market strategy.
I guess, first of all, it's important to understand how big your audience can be. And I say that because a lot of us have expectations that we're going to get up to the like Mark Maron WTF, like million downloads an episode. And I think that that's a goal for a lot of podcasters, when really that's maybe not what success is for your specific podcast. And I say that because I had similar expectations and aspirations when I started Right Now, but really who I was talking to was creatives between the ages of 25 and 50 who often live in the Midwest. So like there's all these things about your audience. Understanding who you're talking to and where these people are is so crucial in understanding, okay, there's X many people who would be interested in my podcast. And it's funny. It's a game that we can play, because I like to say this to new podcasters: your podcast is not for everyone. And that's okay. And if you're able to niche it down so that you're speaking to a very direct, passionate group of people that's often very small, like maybe you're the only podcast that talks about raising pet crickets on a wooden boat. But like over here, you're talking about like bugs. And it's like, okay, you're not going to stand out as a new bug podcaster, but like in the raising bugs on wooden boats niche, maybe that was a terrible example. I don't know why I used that, but it was just the first thing that came to mind. You're going to stand out in your niche because you're the only person talking about that. So niching is important, but also realizing that if you're talking about raising crickets on wooden boats, you're not going to get 1 million downloads per episode because maybe there's not 1 million people in the world who are interested in that niche. So understanding what's important to you, is it reaching more people with a larger focus, or is it building a really passionate audience who waits for your show to come out, who's really, really excited because they love their crickets and they love their boats? And so that's one thing I like to say, is that it's even preferential if your show is not for everyone, because it allows you to really talk to that audience. Now, how do you find that audience? How do you engage that audience? How do you connect with that audience? There's a couple different ways to do it. And by a couple, I mean an infinite amount of ways to do it. But first and foremost, there's not just one way, I think is what I'm trying to say. So talk to your family and friends, threaten them into listening to your podcast, break their kneecaps, all of that good stuff.
Emotional and physical threats. They always work.
Yep. People respond well to threats. Yeah. Do not quote me on that. But also, so some of the strategies that I used were listening to similar shows, listening to and understanding the value that those shows provided and how mine was different. So understand what we call your UVP, your unique value proposition. So understand what makes you different, but also understand who is listening to those other shows that are similar to yours. And I don't want to say like stalk them, but if you can find, so like when I launched Girl in Space, I was listening to Wolf 359, I was listening to Tin Can, I was listening to a few other really good sci-fi shows. And I would go into their followers on Twitter or Instagram or what have you, and just start following those people. Because these were people, if they were following like Wolf 359, if they were following Tin Can on Twitter, then I was like, oh, they might be interested in Girl in Space. And I didn't message any of them. I didn't say, hey, I have a show and you should listen to it, because that gets obnoxious. Nobody wants to be sold. But just even going out there, following those people, and if they have like fewer than a couple hundred followers themselves, they'll notice that you're following them. So if you follow somebody with 48,000 followers already, they're not going to notice you. No. But if you follow someone with a smaller amount, they'll notice you and they'll listen back. And that's actually the feedback that I've gotten. Many of my Girl in Space audience has come from me following them on Twitter. And just following the right people, knowing like, oh, these people are on Twitter. Maybe they're not. Maybe your audience isn't on Twitter. Maybe your audience is on Facebook. Maybe your audience is at the town meeting outside. Like if you have a local podcast. So understanding who your audience is, where they are, how you can connect with them, and then how do you show up in their life? Are you going onto Reddit and answering their questions? There's so many places. And I think a lot of podcasters get frustrated because, there's connecting with other podcasters, which is important, but then there's also connecting with potential new listeners. Both of those are important. Both of them give you different value. And I think that a lot of people don't distinguish between the two. And so a lot of the time I'll tell new podcasters like, hey, if you want to get in the podcasting community and like make friends with fellow podcasters, it's a great idea to connect with the podcasting community, which is largely on Twitter and probably some other places too, but at least the people I've connected with have been on Twitter. A great way to do that is to shout out about their shows and say, hey, I was listening to Oz 9 this weekend, and I think it's a really great sci-fi show. You should listen to it. Being selfless, being generous, being kind with your social media presence, and becoming part of the community. That is not going to get you new listeners for your show. That's going to bring you into the community of podcasters, which has different value to it than advertising your show to potential listeners. And so I think a lot of people sort of conflate which audience they're talking to, the creator audience or the listening audience. And sure, creators listen to shows and they can shout out about shows to their audiences, but I don't think that's necessarily as giant of a growth tool as a lot of us hope that it will be. And as for finding the audiences, a lot of them are on Tumblr. Anywhere that you can find people talking about podcasts, about fandoms, that's a great place. If you have a nonfiction show, providing answers within communities can be very helpful. There's a lot of Facebook groups out there that have people who are looking for podcasts and information that your show might be able to help them with. Then there's also in-person things, which if you're an introvert like us can be intimidating. It can also be expensive and not incredibly accessible to everyone. And there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with being able to attend a live event. So if you have a podcast that reviews like romance novels and you're able to fly and attend the Romance Writers Association conference, like that's great. Not everybody can do that though. And so I think there's still even some, and I don't have an answer to that. I just acknowledge that there's a really big problem there with accessibility to larger networking events where you can in person like meet your potential audience. Because I think that when you're able to shake a hand, when you're able to hand out a business card, that forms a great connection and is a great way to get new listeners and really engage your audience. Even if you are able to do something in your own community, that can be a big help too. I ran a writers group here in downtown Sioux Falls and built up a local reputation that way. And that was one of the ways that I was able to do local speaking gigs in addition to national ones. And once you get into the local speaking circuits, you can kind of grow out there as well.
As our interview was coming to an end, and after Sarah had shared so many nuggets of wisdom, I got curious to know what was coming for her in 2020. She's a force to be reckoned with, and she's always involved in cool projects.
Well, first, thank you for having me on your show. I'm so honored and so delighted to be here. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you.
This has been a fantastic interview. Oh gosh, what's fun that's coming up? Oh, I'm working on season 2 of Girl in Space.
Ooh.
I know. I have like my notebook over on this little table at the side here. And so, earlier coming full circle when we talked about doing all the things, I was actually in a major planning session this morning looking at, okay, I have season 2 of Girl in Space that I need to outline, write, record, produce, all of that stuff. I recorded a new episode of the Right Now podcast for the first time in like 6 months earlier this week. So I have to release that and get that back on schedule. I have, promotion and community building and all of that stuff to do. I have my course that I just launched that I'm working on marketing for. I have some speaking engagements coming up. I have my first live show coming up in April in Seattle, which will be interesting. I'm nervous.
How exciting.
Thank you. So I have to write an episode for that. The event is called Wi-Fi Sci-Fi, and there's going to be, I think, 6 different shows represented, from a Ninth World Journal to Moonbase Theta Out, Oz 9, Sage and Savant, and some other sci-fi audio dramas. We're all kind of doing it together. So it should be interesting. But yeah, fitting all these things in, it's a challenge. So wish me luck this year. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff coming up.
And if you're interested to know more about Sarah, because why wouldn't you be? This is how you can find her.
I'm kind of all over the place, but the big hub for me is going to be sarahwerner.com. That's SARAHWERNER.com. And yeah, that'll have links to all of my projects. It'll have ways to get in touch with me. If you're interested in doing some coaching or just chatting or joining one of my many Facebook communities where I support and help writers and podcasters and all that stuff, they're all free. So yeah, check it out.
So here are some takeaways from Sarah's interview. Number 1, podcasting requires a lot of work. So ask yourself, what am I willing to give up for my podcast? Number 2, define what having a successful podcast means to you. Number 3, a podcast is a communication tool and an experience tool. We are creating a listener's experience with our podcast. Number 4, podcasting can open doors for new opportunities that can advance your career. Number 5, the steps to grow your audience are: identify who your ideal listener is. Don't be afraid to niche down. Go find your audience and engage and connect with them. Always provide value. Understand what is your UVP, unique value proposition. And attend live events where your ideal listener is at.